Welcome to NTD Evening News. Our top story tonight, a Ukraine peace deal and a UK trade agreement. That's what President Trump is discussing today with the UK Prime Minister, what the two say about the ongoing war in Ukraine and potential U.S. tariffs. Iris Tao at the White House. As Trump gets ready to sign a minerals deal with Ukraine, lawmakers from both sides of the aisle weigh in on the agreement. Arian Pazdar has more on what they're saying. A suspected terrorist drives his car into a crowd of people in Israel, injuring more than a dozen. This comes soon after Israel released hundreds of Palestinian prisoners to the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Jason Perry reports. The first batch of the Epstein files were given out to reporters earlier today. Attorney General Pam Bondi said there are more than 250 victims whose identities need to be protected. David Lamb brings us the details. And USAID workers who've been laid off or put on leave have started moving their belongings from D.C. That's as members of the Senate DOGE Caucus met with the president and Elon Musk at the White House. Jason Blair reports. An investigation is underway on the death of actor Gene Hackman and his wife at their New Mexico home. They were found dead for some time.
This is NTD Evening News, live from our global headquarters in New York City. Here's Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. Steps to achieve a ceasefire in Ukraine. That's what President Trump discussed with the British Prime Minister today, as the two are also negotiating a trade deal between the U.S. and the U.K. Joining us now live is NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao. Good evening, Iris. What are the main takeaways from today's White House meeting?
Good evening to you as well, Tiff. So at the top of their meeting agenda today is, of course, a Ukraine peace deal potentially and a trade deal between the U.S. and the U.K. And while the two leaders are vowing, of course, to strengthen ties between the U.S. and U.K. and, of course, acknowledging the historical ties between the two countries and allies, it comes at a time when the U.S., especially when President Trump is vowing reciprocal tariffs on adversaries and allies alike. Starmer, the U.K. Prime Minister today, according to Trump, tried really hard to persuade him not to put tariffs on UK goods. And Trump says, well, he might actually not slap tariffs on UK, adding that they might have a trade deal coming out soon. Watch.
He tried. He was working hard, I'll tell you that. He earned whatever the hell they pay him over there. But he tried. I think there's a very good chance that in the case of these two great friendly countries, I think we could very well end up with a real trade deal where the tariffs wouldn't be necessary.
And while President Trump seems inclined to spare UK, on Wednesday he just threatened another 25% tariffs on EU goods. And that's, of course, as this morning he announces that he will continue his 25% tariffs on both goods from Mexico and Canada starting on March 4th. He's also imposing an additional 10% tariff on Chinese goods. And the reason, he says, is because these countries are not doing enough to stop the flow of fentanyl into the U.S. Watch.
And I used tariffs to even things up. And in particular with China, we took in hundreds of billions of dollars and we had no inflation.
And of course, another major topic of their meeting today is an ongoing talks about a potential ceasefire in Ukraine. Trump says that they're talking about the next steps towards what he calls a very achievable ceasefire. He says he thinks it's going to happen hopefully quickly, and if it does not, it might not actually come to fruition at all. Here's what he said today. Watch.
I want to see soldiers stop getting shot, because largely it's soldiers now. Towns have been obliterated. But it's largely that, and I don't want to pay billions and billions and billions of dollars, nor does the Prime Minister or anybody else, on a senseless war that should have never happened.
Prime Minister Starmer, meanwhile, calls for a deal that makes sure that the aggressor cannot be rewarded. And that's as, of course, Zelenskyy, the Ukrainian prime minister, is set to come to the White House on Friday. The Ukrainian president will come to the White House on Friday to sign a deal to give the access of its rare earth minerals, some of it to the U.S. And that's, of course, as President Trump says, the deal would effectively allow the U.S. to reimburse some of its aid given to Ukraine. But Zelenskyy, meanwhile, has been calling for some concrete and solid security guarantees from Washington. And that's another point that we will keep an eye on tomorrow to see if President Trump actually makes such promises. Back to you.
All right, Iris, thanks for that update. President Trump is set to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy tomorrow to close a minerals deal. U.S. lawmakers have different takes on the agreement. NTD's international correspondent Arian Pazdar has the Ukraine update.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is in Ireland on Thursday, making a quick stop before continuing to the U.S. Zelenskyy is expected to close a minerals deal with President Trump in D.C. on Friday. The exact details of the deal are not clear yet, but Zelenskyy says they'll be discussed during the talks on Friday. Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal says the deal seems extortionist because it might not include security guarantees for Ukraine. Blumenthal adds he also wants to meet with Zelenskyy for bipartisan talks alongside GOP lawmakers.
So that my Republican colleagues can hear from him about how Ukraine's security involves ours and how extortionate tactics from this administration are endangering our security.
Meanwhile, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham says he thinks the deal will change Washington's narrative on Ukraine. That's because the U.S. will finally have a major investment in Ukraine.
I think it's the most important thing we could do. I've been working on this for 2 years, trying to get President Biden to do it, but I think with President Trump doing it, it will change their narrative.
This comes as a U.S. delegation is meeting Russian counterparts in Turkey on Thursday. Russian President Vladimir Putin praised the strengthening of ties.
First contacts with the new U.S. administration give certain hopes. There is mutual determination to work restoration of relations between two countries.
The main goal of Thursday's talks is to restore functionality of the embassies in Washington and Moscow. That's to lay the foundation for peace talks to end the fighting in Ukraine. Arian Pazdar, NTD News.
More than a dozen people were injured in Israel after a suspected terrorist drove his car into a crowd of people at a bus stop. This came the day after Israel released hundreds of Palestinian prisoners to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. NTD's Jason Perry has the story.
Emergency crews in Israel responded to the scene of a car ramming attack that injured 14 people. Police said a 53-year-old Palestinian man from the West Bank drove his car into a crowd of people at a bus stop. Israeli police said they, quote, neutralized the suspect, who was married to an Israeli citizen. And their initial findings indicate that he deliberately targeted civilians. Residents in Israel have faced car ramming attacks from Palestinians for years. This comes just a day after Israel released hundreds of Palestinian prisoners as part of the ceasefire deal with Hamas. The newly released prisoners were seen arriving in the Gaza Strip's Khan Yunis early Thursday, and others were released in the West Bank, who were welcomed by cheering crowds and celebrations. Their release comes shortly after Hamas terrorists handed over the bodies of 4 deceased male Israeli hostages. Their bodies were taken to a forensic center in Israel, and later the identities of all 4 bodies were confirmed, according to Israel's government spokesperson. Meanwhile, residents in Israel continue to gather at what is now called Hostages Square, as they continue to call for the release of all 59 remaining hostages in the Gaza Strip.
If the ceasefire doesn't go through and the deal stops in the middle and our people will be left there, then it would be an enormous pain and fear
Israeli government spokesperson David Mencer on Thursday said that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had authorized a delegation to go to Egypt for negotiations to bring the hostages home.
Okay, that is what the Prime Minister has done because we want to bring them all home. It is our moral obligation. It is our ethical obligation. We need to bring them home right now as soon as possible.
This comes as Palestinians in Jerusalem and the West Bank are preparing for Ramadan, many of them planning to visit Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem.
We know that the weather in Ramadan will be cold, so we started setting up covers to protect people from winter and its cold weather, and to receive the biggest number possible inside the prayer areas and in the courtyards of Al-Aqsa Mosque.
The Muslim holy month of fasting is expected to begin this Saturday or Sunday, depending on the sighting of the new moon. Jason Perry, NTD News.
Earlier today, a group of independent journalists received the first batch of declassified Jeffrey Epstein files in Washington, D.C. But a letter reportedly from Attorney General Pam Bondi suggests there's a lot more to come. NTD's David Lamb reports.
The Department of Justice released binders titled The Epstein Files Phase 1 to a group of independent journalists in D.C. on Thursday. Journalists such as Emily Austin met with President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. The exact details of the meeting are yet to be released. This is what Attorney General Pam Bondi said on Fox News Wednesday night.
What you're going to see hopefully tomorrow is a lot of flight logs, a lot of names, a lot of information, but it's pretty sick what that man did.
Bondi told Fox News' Jesse Waters there were more than 200 victims. She said her office will make sure the victims' identities and personal information are protected. Epstein was arrested in 2019 and charged with sex trafficking of minors. Previously, the financier pleaded guilty to procuring a child for prostitution in 2008. Epstein was well-connected, socializing with high-profile celebrities and members of the British royal family. He often invited them to parties on his private island. He died in his jail cell in 2019. The death was ruled suicide, but his lawyers dispute that. Journalist Emily Austin posted a letter she said was from Attorney General Bondi, expressing frustration after discovering that thousands of additional files were yet to be delivered to her from an FBI field office in New York. Bondi says in the letter that the documents will be delivered to her by Friday morning. David Lamb, NTD News.
Members of the Senate DOGE Caucus met with President Trump and Elon Musk at the White House today. That says some USAID workers who've been laid off or put on administrative leave start to move their belongings out of the Reagan building in Washington, D.C. NTD's Jason Blair brings us the latest.
The Senate DOGE Caucus met with President Trump and Elon Musk at the White House talking about their goals. Now, the Senate DOGE Caucus is similar to their House counterpart, working with the Department of Government Efficiency, but more from the legislative side, with the goal to, quote, root out waste, fraud, and abuse and ensure the government is working for Americans. The caucus says they are hitting the ground running. After the meeting, caucus chair Senator Joni Ernst and Senator Roger Marshall released public statements. They said that the meeting went well and they were able to hear directly from Musk what his goals are.
We heard about the work that they are doing through the agencies, the dollars that they are saving of waste for our taxpayers.
If there's one thing I would communicate to folks, it's just that the compassion that Elon has for the people that do work for the federal government, that there are lots of people that are doing a great job. Their jobs are important. We want to make sure that we save those.
Chair Ernst listed some things that the Senate DOGE Caucus has been up to. One of those is an act introduced by Senator Marshall aimed at prohibiting funding going to institutions that conduct gain-of-function research, and another act by Senator Risch aimed at reducing the national debt. And in other related DOGE news, some U.S. aid workers were seen gathering their belongings from the Reagan building here in Washington, D.C. Reportedly, they were given Thursday and Friday to gather their things. There were also some supporters gathered outside of the building holding signs. Some of them were applauding in support as the workers were leaving the building. And one lady was even seen trying to peel off tape that was covering up words on one of the signs out front of the building. Now, one worker who was laid off and a union representative called the situation tragic, difficult, with very little communication.
There's been no offboarding with us. It's just been very sudden, everything. One day being locked out of the building, the next being told you're on admin leave.
We've had our emails. Most people have had their email accounts shut off, so they're getting notices third party from Facebook groups and from chat groups.
On Sunday, the Trump administration announced that at least 1,600 USAID workers were laid off, with pretty much everyone else put on administrative leave, except for, quote, mission critical staff. Reporting on Capitol Hill, Jason Blair, NTD News.
We turn now to the lawsuits filed against federal agencies to stop them from giving DOGE access to sensitive records. How our court's ruling on the cases. Our legal correspondent Arlene Richards takes a look.
Court cases are still being filed by a number of organizations and individuals in an effort to block the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, from accessing sensitive data across several federal agencies. 11 cases about access have been filed against several federal agencies and DOGE to date. Filings are in 4 different federal district courts with rulings from 7 different judges. 4 of them have ruled in favor of the plaintiffs who filed the cases. They've given plaintiffs temporary or emergency relief, which means those agencies have to stop or limit employees of DOGE from accessing sensitive records. But 3 judges, 2 in Washington and 1 in Virginia, have denied requests for immediate relief, saying the plaintiffs either didn't have standing to bring the cases or they didn't provide convincing arguments that they would be irreparably harmed. And while it appears that the Trump administration has 3 wins, at least one of those cases involves an agency that was blocked by another court. Last week, Washington Judge Randolph Moss denied a University of Southern California student group's request to stop DOGE from accessing Department of Education records. But Maryland Judge Deborah Boardman on Monday granted a similar request from a teachers union. I spoke to attorney Gerard Felitti to find out why courts are ruling differently on similar complaints.
The cases seem to be looking at a few different things. One of them is the ability of DOGE to have access to records to begin with. And what we've seen there for courts is that it really does depend on the information that's being sought. Where courts have drawn a line seems to be personal information about other parties, for example, in the Department of Education, barring DOGE from getting access to Social Security numbers from students who have applied for aid, as seeing that as unnecessary. So where we have seen courts allow DOGE to go forward, it's there's less in dispute about the information that's sought, and it's more clearly tailored to what DOGE is meant to do, which is to weed out programs that are deemed inefficient.
The attorney said when there are conflicting rulings related to the same agencies, the Trump administration has to take it up on appeal. And in 4 additional cases, no rulings have been entered yet. Like the other cases, various parties are asking courts to stop agencies from giving DOGE access to sensitive records and claiming it violates their privacy rights.
Actor Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy Arakawa have been found dead in their home. According to the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office, Hackman's body was found in the home's mudroom and his wife was located in a bathroom. An open pill bottle and space heater were found near her body. One dog was also found dead in a closet. According to the search warrant, no immediate signs of carbon monoxide poisoning or a gas leak were found. Authorities say no signs of foul play have been found, but they are still trying to figure out what happened. Coming up, a bipartisan bill in the Senate would ban Chinese AI app DeepSeek on U.S. government devices. That's over concerns the app is sending user information to the Chinese Communist Party. Jack Bradley reports. And 2 U.S. lawmakers are concerned over China's plans for a super embassy in London. They warn of espionage risks and say approving the plans would reward China despite its major human rights violations. Malcolm Hudson brings us the details after the break. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Does the Chinese regime have your data? Republican and Democrat senators introduced a bill that would ban Chinese AI app DeepSeek on government devices. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has the details.
A bipartisan group of senators are introducing a bill to ban Chinese AI platform DeepSeek on government devices over data privacy concerns. Now, the bill is introduced by Republican Senators John Husted and Pete Ricketts and Democratic Senator Jackie Rosen. A similar bill was introduced in the House earlier this month, also bipartisan. DeepSeek is similar to ChatGPT, but now even more popular with more downloads. But there's the concern that since DeepSeek is a Chinese company, user data would end up into the hands of the CCP. That's as China's national intelligence law requires all of its citizens and businesses to provide literally all data to authorities upon request. Now, it's the same reason TikTok received overwhelming bipartisan support to ban the app. And the CEO of Faroot Security said that DeepSeek is designed to send data to China Mobile, which is a company banned in the U.S. He also said that it creates a digital footprint on each user to track its users on other websites.
It gives the ability to potentially survey Americans on any other websites once they have visited a DeepSeek and start navigating to any other pages, such as maybe booking even a doctor's appointment, which is a very, very alarming development.
Senator Tom Cotton wants to take the ban a step further, calling for a government device ban on all AI tools owned by Chinese companies.
That data is forever, and it can be sensitive, and it can be used to blackmail or get leverage over a person.
Senator Cotton also elaborated about the censorship on Chinese apps like DeepSeek, that certain topics the Chinese Communist Party deems controversial are banned from the apps, even in the U.S.
Go on X, go on Facebook, go on Snapchat. Compare what you can learn there about, say, Tiananmen Square or Taiwan or the Uyghurs or Tibet to what you can learn on TikTok, which is nothing. There are stories about this in the news recently because of the new DeepSeek AI search engine, about how you type in Tiananmen Square and it'll tell you that it can't say anything about that.
South Korea put a nationwide ban on DeepSeek earlier this month over data privacy concerns. We have Taiwan, Italy, and Australia banning the app from government devices, and several states in the U.S., including Texas, New York, Florida, and Virginia, have done the same. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Jack Bradley, NTD News.
2 U.S. lawmakers are voicing concern over China's plans to build a super embassy in London. It would be a short distance away from the city's governmental and financial hubs. The lawmakers warn of espionage risks and say accepting the plans would reward China despite major human rights violations. NTD's international correspondent Malcolm Hudson has more for us from London.
2 top House lawmakers expressed serious concerns about China's plans to build a so-called mega embassy in London. Their call came ahead of President Trump's meeting with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Chairman of the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, John Mulinar, and Congressional Executive China Commission Chair Chris Smith said granting China such a prominent diplomatic presence would be a counterproductive, unearned reward for human rights abuses. This in a letter to British Ambassador Lord Peter Mandelson on Wednesday. The Chinese regime first announced plans for a nearly 700,000 square foot embassy in 2018. The plans received a boost in January after the British Foreign and Interior Ministers indicated they would support the construction plans. The proposed embassy would be built at the Royal Mint Court, a historic location once used to make British coins, and just across from the Tower of London. If built, it would be China's largest embassy in Europe, 10 times bigger than the current embassy in London and nearly twice the size of the Chinese embassy in Washington. Smith and Mulinar warned such a diplomatic foothold would only embolden the Chinese regime in efforts to intimidate and harass UK citizens and Chinese dissidents. They wrote, China's transnational repression operations are well documented in the UK and throughout Europe. In October 2022, Hong Kong pro-democracy protester Bob Chan was dragged from a protest outside the Chinese Consulate General in Manchester onto the consulate grounds, where he was then beaten by staff members. Speaking to the Epoch Times in March 2023, Chan said he was indignant at Chinese diplomats' behavior, but felt powerless to hold them to account. The 2 lawmakers reminded Mandelson that the British government is likely well aware of the Chinese Communist Party's systematic effort to co-opt social and business elites to advance its political and economic goals through malign influence operations. The Royal Mint site is a short walk away from London's financial and banking hub and a quick journey away from British Parliament. British authorities have also uncovered alleged Chinese spy cases in recent years, such as those of Yang Tembo and Christine Lee, who formed close relationships with key British figures. Smith and Moulinar added China's human rights violations is another reason the British government should reconsider the embassy plans. They said they would be happy to discuss their concerns directly with Mandelson. Malcolm Hudson, NTD News, London.
Coming up, we sat down with Jenna Ellis at this year's International Christian Media Convention to get her thoughts on the second Trump administration, including DOGE, press access, and educating the next generation of American leaders. And do everyday Americans trust legacy media? We speak with folks in D.C. about that and about the White House's decision to handpick its press poll when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. This year's International Christian Media Convention wrapped up in Texas today. We were at the event yesterday and spoke with Jenna Ellis, a senior policy advisor and radio host at the American Family Association. She's also a former lawyer for President Trump's 2020 campaign. She shared her thoughts on DOGE, America's shifting media landscape, and bringing back the Bible as a historical text in classrooms. Take a look.
Jenna Ellis, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's great to see you in person.
Yes. Well, I feel like it's been a while since we caught up, but I want to dive straight in. Obviously, I feel like every other second, new headlines, new developments with this second Trump administration. Right now, all the fuss over DOGE and the 5 points they have to email. Maybe you don't have to email. Oh, now you do have to email. What are your thoughts on all of that?
Well, I love that President Trump just hit the ground running, and I think that his transition team was so much more prepared this time than the first administration, which is understandable because he was the outsider coming in 2016, but he kind of is again in this second administration. And I loved his interview with Elon Musk where Elon was wearing the t-shirt that just said tech support, because I think we really need that in a government that has been able to manipulate the processes in D.C. to essentially hide money in the way that USAID has benefited all of these organizations that the taxpayers really didn't vote for and didn't support. So I think that overall it's a very good thing, and we're only a little over a month in, and so I think for the next 4 years it's going to be very important for Congress to legislate around what the Trump administration and Elon and DOGE are discovering so that we can have enduring wins and not have all of this undone in the next administration.
Now, another one of the big changes was who gets to access to the White House, right, in terms of the news. So normally that's under the White House press corps, but now it's the White House deciding. You know, looking back a bit, during the election cycle, we saw both sides really going on, say, podcasts or other types of media instead of the traditional mainstream media. What do you make of maybe the shifting media landscape and where people are turning to for their news?
Yeah, I love that the White House is allowing non-traditional and non-legacy media to come in and ask questions, because I think that is more representative of the American people and our questions rather than just relying on the gatekeeping of legacy media. And here we're at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, and I work with the American Family Association and American Family Radio, which has been there for, we're 60 years as an organization, but to have Christian broadcasting specifically and to have that type of access now to the White House, I think is incredibly important, not just for issues that have been traditionally religious, like First Amendment concerns or pro-life, but also a lot of the policy decisions that affect everyday Americans that we're concerned about. So I think it's a great move, and I can see why legacy media is upset, because a lot of their viewers are probably turning elsewhere, but it's really time for that, especially when we're in such a dynamic multimedia landscape.
I feel like another one of the changes is potentially the gutting of the Department of Education. We've been seeing the test scores seem like they're dropping every year, whereas the U.S. is pouring more money than any other country per student into public education. What do you make of the education landscape and the changes we're seeing, whether that's more homeschooling, classical education, school choice, where maybe public school is the best choice for a family? What do you make of that landscape?
Well, I personally was homeschooled K through 12, and this was back when that was very non-traditional, and my parents were kind of at the forefront of the homeschooling movement. And I can say without a doubt that was the greatest blessing in my life, to not only have a specialized education that I was able to discover my love of law, when I was 14, I knew I wanted to go to law school. I mean, that's something that only came from a personalized education, but also discipleship and mentorship from my parents. I didn't spend all day weekdays with someone else in training. So I think during COVID, when a lot of families were forced to try homeschooling, a lot of them discovered, wow, I actually love being around my kids, and this is a little easier than we've thought. And so I love that homeschooling has jumped. I think the statistics are showing, 200% compared to pre-pandemic, and that's a silver lining because parents are rediscovering a joy of education of their own children. But in terms of the Department of Education, it's been a consideration for a really long time for conservatives that the federal government shouldn't be involved in having the financial strings that are attached to the dollars in education, because this really isn't funding students. It's not funding parents that make those decisions for their kids. It's really funding the teachers unions and the institutions, and it's also having the federal government be able to tell the states what they have to teach in the publicly funded education. So I am all about school choice, but also to take the federal government out of it. If you look at the U.S. Constitution, education is not a subject matter that is given to the federal government, has no business being open. So I would love to see President Trump not only advocate as he has for school choice, but also dismantle the Department of Education entirely.
I want to expand on that a bit because we've been seeing in the news, say, the 10 Commandments, the whole debate around that. Louisiana was the first state. Now it's kind of tied up in courts. There's just a hearing in Nebraska on Monday about whether to have that, and in God we trust, those words up. Now, the critics are saying this is violating the separation of church and state. What's your view from maybe the legal perspective, but also the faith perspective of what America was founded on?
Yeah, well, this whole idea of a separation of church and state, meaning that religion cannot be involved in state-funded activities, is purely a myth. I mean, if we look at the background and the development that our founders had for the Constitution itself, it limits government. It doesn't limit the activities of religious people that can engage with government-funded activities. And so there have been a lot of case precedent to say that just because you are a Christian school, for example, or you have Christian classes, that you can't receive government funding. So I think that's one issue. But then also to suggest that somehow the Bible shouldn't be taught in schools. I know Ryan Walters, who's the superintendent of schools in Oklahoma, is bringing the Bible back from a historical perspective. And what I think a lot of the naysayers would say to that is that, oh, this is just specifically a religious text, but it's so much more than that. It teaches history, and it teaches also a worldview that's entirely appropriate for classrooms and for education, and it used to be taught as history. And so I think with the left that is pushing so hard to rewrite history, to change America's founding, to change world history, bringing back these solid educational tools, including the Bible as a historical text, is something that absolutely doesn't violate the U.S. Constitution and should be advocated for.
Stay with this, but look ahead a bit. So, we've seen with, say, TikTok or all these different video apps, the shorter and shorter attention spans, especially of younger kids who are going to be our future leaders. How important is it to have that foundation that you're just laying out, where we know what this country was founded upon, whether or not there were flaws, right? Acknowledging that, but not erasing it and learning from it and becoming the leaders of the future?
I love this question because this was actually one of, I think, the best benefits to me of homeschooling is because my mom actually taught history and world history from the very beginning, Genesis, all the way through the major civilizations in chronological order. And then when we got to America's founding, then I understood where we came from, why our founders left England, why they pursued religious liberty, what they understood from the historical world civilizations and also from the thinkers, Augustine and Aquinas and all of these other church leaders as well, and why religious liberty was so incredibly important. Because in order to have liberty, we have to be able to first believe, but also be able to act on that belief. And that's what free exercise means. It's not just about having a sincerely held belief, but being able to practice our beliefs. And the government should not be able to restrain that in a church setting or a church context. And so having that understanding of history, it's not to say that every moment in history we should say was a good thing or a right decision. We should learn from some of the bad decisions of history. history, and we even look at the Bible. I mean, there are a lot of examples of very bad examples, even in the historical context of the Bible, but that we can learn from. And we can certainly, as individuals, take that in terms of our own character, but as a nation and as a society that wants to pursue a more perfect union, as our declaration acknowledges, we have to understand where we came from, why these founding first principles were so important to our founding fathers, and where they need to take us into the next generation and beyond.
Now, in terms of this second Trump presidency, there's a few differences. One was since that first assassination attempt, we've seen a different Trump, if you will, at least in the public. And I think this may be how he was with his family, but he's changed his relationship with God. He's mentioned that he really believes that he was saved in that moment, that he's here to do something. How do you see that playing out in this second Trump administration and what that means for America, not just for these 4 years, but down the road?
I think you're right that it has truly changed him. And I don't see how you could go through that type of a trauma, quite frankly, and not have that shake you to your core and have a fundamental different outlook on life. I know it affected him and his family. And, you know, having worked for him and knowing him very personally, I love to see that he is a little bit softer side sometimes, instead of just, you know, kind of the mean tweets that we're all accustomed to, forward facing. A lot of us who have known him personally and have shared some of those kinder moments, I think it's actually a position of strength when he shows those moments and he's very personal and he's very real. And as a Christian myself, I absolutely believe that God intervened and saved his life for a purpose, for his own sake and his family, but also for our nation. And it was very clear that God intervened, and I'm grateful to see him so publicly acknowledge the Lord's presence and his sovereignty in that moment.
Well, Jenna, Ellis, thank you so much for your time.
A recent poll suggests 26% of Americans have no trust at all that the media will report the facts. Meanwhile, the White House is now deciding which news outlets get to join the press pool. What do everyday Americans think about all this? NTD's Sam Wong was out on the National Mall in D.C. to hear from them.
You watch the legacy news outlets these days. Do you trust them?
You know, I don't. They don't tell me much. I don't watch MSNBC. I don't watch Fox. I don't watch the ones that specialize in belly aching about the other side.
More or less on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 no, 10 yes, probably a 6 or 7. There's just too much news being broadcast 24/7. And too much of it's commentary. We just need hard news.
I do believe that a lot of different major news outlets kind of manipulate the news. They get to decide what people hear and what they see, but I think it's a problem across the political spectrum.
When you measure the outlets against each other, that you can see a swing in one direction or the other.
It just depends on where you get your news from, right? You're gonna get one version here and you're gonna get one version there. So in between, it's kind of up to you to use your critical thinking skills.
I want an objective party to give me the news, and right now I don't feel like we have objective news sources.
Going forward, the Trump administration says the White House will get to decide which news outlet will have access to the president and the press room. So what do you think about that?
Well, the president has a right to determine who talks to him, and he should be more middle of the road and listen to all aspects of the news media.
How do you decide which group of people gets to get in? How do that controls what we have access to?
I would say the people that are reported on shouldn't have the ability to choose who's reporting them.
We all know the MSNBCs and the CNNs and stuff like that, right? And they've been doing it for a long time, Fox, all that. So yeah, I don't think there's any harm in making some room for aspiring smaller, groups.
If it's good or bad, I guess history will judge that, but the fact that he's opened the door a little bit broader is encouraging, I guess.
The more sources that the American people and the world in general have access to is a positive thing, in my opinion.
Coming up, as Florida prepares for another busy spring break season, cities are taking a firm stance on safety. Christina Corona highlights what you can expect if you're planning to hit the beaches this year. And in the NFL, how Taylor Swift's music helped Travis Kelce get over his Super Bowl loss. Dave Martin joins us to explain when we return. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer with spring break around the corner. A new round of tourists will be flocking to the Sunshine State, but there are rules in place to keep the community safe during one of the busiest times of the year. NTD's Christina Corona has the details.
With spring break just around the corner, some Florida cities announced they are tightening the rules from stricter parking regulations to an increased police presence. Officials are cracking down on rowdy crowds. Miami Beach made it clear on its website that rowdy spring breakers are not welcome this year, announcing strict measures to reinforce its stance. The city stated they will impose tough measures in March to reinforce the message that the city is not interested in being a spring break party destination. Disorderly crowds, lawless behavior, and violence will not be tolerated. In Miami Beach, visitors can expect $100 parking fees, curfews, a heavy police presence, strict DUI enforcement, and security checkpoints. However, officials in nearby Fort Lauderdale announced they are welcoming everyone.
Fort Lauderdale, of course, has been known for a spring break season, but it also continues to represent itself as a safe and fun place for kids from all over to come and enjoy the break from Fort Lauderdale. We open our doors to everybody. We welcome all tourists, and we're very happy to be able to host Spring Break 2025 again this year.
However, there will be stricter rules for spring breakers.
Miami ghosted you like that? That's crazy.
But don't worry, Broward County's right here. We got beaches, we got vibes, but remember, we got rules.
Alcohol, coolers, tents, tables, and camping are all banned on the beach. A heavy police presence will be in place, and at 5:30 p.m. each day, a mandatory beach sweep will clear the area. This crackdown follows an influx of rowdy spring breakers flocking to Florida's beaches after the pandemic, as well as a shooting at Miami Beach in 2023. But Fort Lauderdale officials say they're ready.
We had very, very few arrests last year. Yet we had one of the highest spring break populations ever in our history, in recent history anyway.
With strict rules in place, Florida cities are working to keep spring break safe and under control. So whether you're heading to Miami Beach or Fort Lauderdale, pack your sunscreen, stay hydrated, and be ready for increased enforcement and guidelines. Christina Corona, NTD News.
And now for your sports news, we're joined by NTD's Dave Martin. Dave, a lot going on today, but let's start in the NFL as the league is considering a change to the overtime format. What specifically are they looking at to change?
I mean, the fairness of it, it would seem. I mean, right now, the overtime rules are really skewed towards whoever wins the coin toss, because that team then gets the ball first. And then since it's sudden death, meaning whoever scores first wins, the coin toss actually becomes the most important play. But of course, there's no skill in picking, heads or tails. Now, as is right now, if you win the coin toss, you get the ball to start overtime. You score a touchdown, the game is over without the other team even getting the ball. So I really don't see it as a very fair system. Now they've tried to make it, less sudden death by declaring if you get a field goal to start the overtime, then the other team does get a chance to tie it or win it. And they've also said in the playoffs, if you get a touchdown to start the overtime, they will give the other team a second chance. But unless they go to the college overtime system, which guarantees equal possessions for both teams, it's just not going to be totally fair. It's almost like they're trying to hang on to their old system just to try not to admit defeat that just does not really work. So I really don't think this works right now, so I really hope they completely revamp it.
Well, elsewhere in the league, Ravens kicker Justin Tucker released a statement yesterday saying, quote, "I did not act inappropriately." That's after recent allegations of sexual misconduct emerged from multiple massage therapists. Now that's according to the Baltimore Banner. What's been the league's response?
So far there's been nothing public anyway. Now these allegations were made over the past month, which was after the Ravens season ended. So the league and the team really aren't quite under the gun to respond like would be if this was during the season. Now ESPN is reporting the league's investigations the league's investigators, they've been in Baltimore speaking with some of these women who've made these allegations. Now these allegations reportedly were made from 2012 through 2016. Now Tucker, he's a very, very good kicker. In fact, he's the most accurate kicker in NFL history, 89% field goals for his career. He's a 7-time Pro Bowl player. He's the last remaining player from their 2012 Super Bowl winning team. So we will actually continue to follow the story, of course.
Wow, moving to your Kansas City Chiefs team, All-Pro tight end Travis Kelce says he will play next season. That's according to a report on the Pat McAfee Show. How does his return affect the chances of winning another Super Bowl?
I mean, certainly without him, their chances certainly diminish. I mean, because last year, their biggest problem was the lack of an explosive offense. They were very average on offense, despite maybe the best quarterback in the league. Now, Kelce, he's 35 years old. Even though his Pro Bowl numbers are slowly declining, he still led the team in receiving yards. He made another Pro Bowl. That's his 10th in a row. And he and Mahomes really have great chemistry together. Now, he did admit on his New Heights podcast that the Eagles broke his heart by beating him in the Super Bowl, denying them that three-peat that no one's done. But he said he dealt with it by listening to some Taylor Swift music, saying she has something for everything. So he's got that going for him.
Well, looking at NBA news, San Antonio Spurs head coach Greg Popovich, who's been away from the team since suffering a stroke last November, told the team today he won't be returning this season. What are his prospects for returning next year?
Well, he says he hopes to return in the future, so it doesn't sound like anything is definite. Now, I'm sure the team, of course, would love to have him back. He's won 5 NBA titles. He's been their coach since 1996. But at the same time, he turned 76 years old last month. Not only is he the oldest coach in the league, he's the oldest coach in league history. Now, meanwhile, the team could be at a turning point, too. They've missed the playoffs the last 5 years, but after making it 22 straight times. But now they have Victor Wembanyama, who's really a budding superstar. He's only 21 years old, but he's out for the season with a blood clot in his shoulder. Meanwhile, Chris Paul is their point guard. He's going to turn 40 this May. He hasn't talked about retirement that I have heard, but of course he's at that age right now. So there's a lot up in the air for the Spurs this offseason, including Popovich.
A lot to look for there. Dave, as always, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tiff.
And that's all for today's news. For round-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.